Welcome to episode 27 of Anchored in Education. I'm E. Scott England, and Anchored in Education is the podcast dedicated to all things education. Educators across the world routinely engage in conversations surrounding fundamentals, concepts, and new ideas that improve this great profession. Sometimes we agree, other times we disagree. But at the end of the day, we are all anchored in education. A few months ago, I was sitting in a conference room in Springfield, Illinois. I was there for the Illinois School for Advanced Leadership, of which I am a member of the 5th cohort. Our speaker for the day was one of the co-authors of the book, The 5 Levers to Improve Learning. The speaker was Dr. Tony Frontier. Dr. Tony Frontier is an associate professor for Cardinal Stritch University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Tony has co-authored several books, including Making Teachers Better, Not Bitter, Effective Supervision, and, of course, The 5 Levers to Improve Learning. From the minute he started speaking, I began soaking in every word. I've never written as many notes, thoughts, and ideas as I did in any other one-day workshop I've ever attended. Right from the gate, he used an example of a driver blowing past a stop sign. When a taller stop sign was installed, people continued to blow past it. Turns out, the height of the stop sign wasn't the issue. We do the same thing in education by seeing a problem and executing the wrong strategy to fix it. But I'm going to let Tony do the explaining because I have a feeling that he is going to ignite some reflection today as we discuss the 5 levers. Tony, welcome to Anchored in Education.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Hey, now before we get started, I usually ask all the guests this. We want to find out a little bit more about you and how you became anchored in education.
Sure. I come from a family of educators. My father was a principal all while growing up. My mom did work in counseling capacity in the high school I went to, actually. And aunts, uncles, and so on, all involved in education. And started my teaching career in Milwaukee Public Schools. And from there, after teaching middle school, I became a building level administrator in Whitefish Bay, Wisconsin, Whitefish Bay High School, and became a curriculum director for 10 years in the school district of Whitefish Bay. And for about the last 10 years now, I've been at Cardinal Stritch University as a professor in the leadership program, where I work with master's in educational leadership students and doctoral students in leadership, and spent some time directing the future ed program at Cardinal Stritch as well.
Okay, and I'm guessing during this time at Cardinal Stritch that you have co-authored the book, The 5 Levers to Improve Learning. Is that right?
Yes. Yep, that
all
is
right.
correct.
Well, that's what we're talking about today. And for me, I was hooked by page 3. So this was the vignette on the kitchen remodel. And
Yeah.
I'll quickly sum it up, that kitchen remodel for listeners. After the remodel is complete, the first meal is prepared. But sadly, it tastes the way it did in the old kitchen. And you mentioned that anyone who hears about the kitchen remodel, they'll undoubtedly be saying, well, of course remodeling the kitchen won't make the food taste better. I thought the same thing when I heard you speak, but yet, I mean, isn't this essentially what we do with changes in our school?
Yeah, Scott. It's really the central metaphor that we use in the book. And the idea is oftentimes we engage in really significant efforts to make change. But at the point of contact that matters most, really between the teacher and the child's experience in school, oftentimes the child doesn't notice, certainly not from a learning perspective. And that metaphor then kind of sets up the foundational framework for how do we think about change, and where do we exert effort in order to improve our schools.
When we get into the improvement in schools, that's when we're going to talk about the 5 levers. But I think it's probably important to understand before we get into those different levers that we must first understand leverage errors. And so, again, it's described clearly that we won't get increased student achievement by, say, painting the buses brighter or changing the drop off locations. But can you go into more detail the alignment of intent, effort, and results?
Sure. The A lot of the change that we work toward, a lot of the changes we make in schools can be clarified through this notion of leverage. So, a lever is we exert effort in one area and we get more significant results or accomplish something that could not have been accomplished otherwise in another area. A lot of the things we debate and discuss in the field really are kind of macro components
Uh-huh.
that if all I know, about a school is that it's a charter school and it has a block schedule and there's one-to-one laptops and personalized learning and multi-age classrooms. Um, I really can't predict if student achievement is higher than would have been predicted given other factors, just by knowing some of those kind of big ticket items. They just don't get down to the level, as I alluded to earlier, of that experience between the child and the teacher. So the way Jim Rickabaugh, co-author of mine, and I, the way we talk about that mistake in the book is the leverage error. So we wanted more collaboration. We got late starts. We wanted more student engagement. We got a block schedule. We wanted to increase student achievement. We got common assessments that don't really assist much
Right.
in supporting student learning.
And this was another example, kind of right off, where you had, I think you just called it School A and School B, but it was essentially the same thing. That on, I guess on paper through description, one looked a whole lot better than the other. But when you actually got down to the pieces, I mean, is that what we're talking about here?
Yeah, exactly. So you look at a lot of the the big changes. Again, some of the issues that capture headlines, standards-based report cards or block schedules or collaborative release time. If you look at the net effect of those types of changes on student achievement, it tends to be very small. Now, those types of changes can be pathways or kind of clear the runway for other more significant changes that need to happen in the classroom. But the challenge is that, let's take collaboration for example. Um, Teacher collaboration.
Uh huh.
We can spend 2 years changing the schedule and creating more release time and trying to make that change occur. And the assumption is that the only reason our teachers aren't collaborating as effectively as we'd hoped is because they don't have the time to do so. And if we just create that time, collaboration will occur. Now, that time can absolutely be an inhibiting factor, but what are the frameworks? What are the norms? What's the professional development? What's the reason we give for teachers to collaborate effectively in the time that they do have together? And that's a piece that's an example of we think we have to pull this big structural lever
Uh huh.
related to the schedule, and we wait a couple of years. We go to the board and we wait to make that happen. But in reality, there are components of an initiative like effective collaboration that if we kind of ask ourselves, what are the strategies that we support our teachers' use of, and do we have clear goals and reasons around what we're collaborating toward? Do we have frameworks or protocols for collaboration? And sometimes pulling those elements in can get the initiative moving sooner than we thought, and can clarify what's really the intent of this change we are reaching for.
Well, let's just get right into the levers then when we're talking about the change. Lever one, structure. Here, as you kind of alluded to, we're talking about schedules. We're talking staffing, tools, administrative processes. So first, do you feel this is what I got from the book
Yeah.
that structure is a frequently pulled lever when trying to bring about improved learning, and second, how can we properly utilize the structure lever?
Yeah. So the thing to keep in mind, and that kitchen metaphor, and I've had people in schools and districts who've used the book. Um, the kitchen metaphor we started our conversation with is a really important one to keep in mind. And they've even got this shorthand where they'll be talking about something at the administrative table and says, but if we make that change, will we be remodeling the kitchen and expecting the food to taste better? The important piece to keep in mind is what is the why are we making this change, right? What do we want the effect of this new teacher evaluation system or this new schedule or this new off the shelf formative assessment system, whatever it may be? What is it we want to be different? If the structure of the school can change, but student learning experiences largely will remain the same, um, then we need to consider that perhaps we've made a leverage error and we've confused structure with student experience. Changing from a middle school to a junior high, or what's the purpose? Why are we doing this? And how will we behave and act differently to make it happen is what's really important to keep in mind. And I think part of the challenge there, when we talk about the kind of the Western conceptualization of change is Archimedes. Give me a lever long enough, and I can move the world.
Right.
Um, but we can change an entire school if kids don't feel different about their schooling experience. Well, what have we really changed?
Absolutely. All right, so let's shift here to sample lever two. This lever includes the grouping of students in any classroom, program, learning opportunity at any given time. And so we see this all the time as we ability group students based on their performance. Um, how can the misuse of the sample lever lead to more harm than good to students? And how should we be seeing this lever used?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the idea here is that an inhibitor of learning is the ability and opportunity for teachers to align instructional strategy and learning goals to the needs of the 25 or 35 students in front of them. So on the surface, it does make sense to say, well, if we had kids with similar learner profiles in the same classroom, it seems like it would be more efficient to teach those students. But there's a lot of research, and John Hattie does a really good job talking about that research in his visible learning works, that says even if we cluster kids differently and group kids differently, multi-age classrooms, for example, we tend to teach in very similar ways.
Right.
So what can happen, two things. One, we kind of mistake, well, we can go faster with these kids, so that must be better. Or, well, we just have to go slower with this group, and we'll meet their needs. That's usually not the case. That's typically not what anyone who's an advocate for good differentiation would ask for. But an even bigger challenge with why it's important to be so mindful of structure or sampling students related to structure and how we group kids, is that oftentimes there's a liability to grouping students. And as early as first grade, students can talk about who the quote unquote, not my words, but research, the quote unquote smart kids in a class are.
Right.
So if you get a group of kids who by second grade feel like they're in the low and the slow group, And then you add, complexities and realities of stereotypes and groups that have historically, underachieved and been underserved. Now you've got stereotype in the mix. And so if we're putting kids in groups based on learner profiles, um, and especially if there's a stigma of, uh, inequality or a stigma of lack of ability as related to any of those groupings, boy, we better be sure that the instruction that we're going to deliver is going to be so, tailored to that group that it's going to transcend some of those other liabilities.
A lot can be done right there in the classroom that we often overlook.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So let's get into lever 3, because I think this is one we hear about all the time, including already earlier in this episode, and that's standards.
Yeah.
Here we're talking about the expectations for student learning. Now, as the book points out, what we typically see is simply a more is better approach. But let's talk and see if you can maybe explain how standards should be used more as quality and not quantity.
Yeah. Great. Yes. Um, part of the challenge with the standards movement, which is like 30 years old now, um, it is that if we really do look at the complexity of any set of standards, um, we see some really heavy words, summarize and synthesize and analyze and design. And um, to assess those things, you really have to go deep, to teach and assess those things. You really have to go deep. Most of uh, what is easy to assess, in education is kind of the least important. Right, wrong, yes, no, true, false, um, basic facts kind of stuff is important, right? Kids need academic background knowledge. Kids need basic math skills, etc.
Right.
But those things in isolation will never get a student to be able to demonstrate proficiency in the breadth and depth of the standards as they're articulated in any state. The challenge is, if we have a curriculum that focuses on coverage and focuses on accumulation of points, um, we can really just skim the surface of what the standards describe. So that notion of what is the standard, what will we, not I, but what will we as a group of educators working in the same system accept as evidence of quality, accept as evidence of proficiency? And how will we help students understand this is what they are working toward? That's really challenging work. And it only occurs through a prioritization of standards. It only occurs by identifying some common success criteria within schools, where within each discipline we've identified 6 to 10 uh, areas of quality in each discipline. Uh, and we, as the adults, have a shared understanding of what the 8 math practices or the 8 science practices or what reading comprehension or quality writing. Until we have a shared understanding of what those things look like, until we can assess those things in similar, consistent, valid, reliable ways, um, kids won't be able to do that. And if a kid doesn't understand, what it is they're working toward as related to the standards, too often the default is it's just, well, hey, tell me what to do, teach. I'll get this work done. I'll turn it in, and we'll move on to the next thing.
Compliancy.
Yeah, exactly. It becomes a compliance and a coverage model. I think Howard Gardner used to talk about that as the text test compromise, I believe is what it was. And it's kind of this unspoken rule of, hey, teach, just don't give me anything that I can't find right in the textbook, and I won't push you too hard. Um, and anything he assessed me on is fair game, but at least we know it was fair. The standards, as they're currently articulated, academic content and what's easy to assess is a component of any state framework you might take a look at. But those rich verbs, compare, contrast, analyze, synthesize, build, design, create, those are much harder to assess, and it doesn't happen with an assignment here or there. And kind of the litmus test I hold for this is, if we were really serious about the standards, we could look at those key words. We could look at words like synthesize, summarize, and analyze. And I should be able to go into any middle school or high school and say, how does your department define, synthesize, summarize, analyze? What are the quality characteristics you look for in, grade level appropriate synthesis, analysis, and summary? And what are the ways you assess those things? And if I kind of put that gauntlet, on the table, a lot of times teachers realize that they as individuals have in their head what those things are, and they can describe or define what those things are, and they can describe or define what they would look for in those performances. But when you get a group of 6, 8, 10 teachers together, it's like, that's not how I assess it. I don't define it that way, or I haven't thought about it that way before. So the part of the trick then is you can have 60 adults in a building who can defend their approach. But if I'm a kid in that system and there are 60 different definitions, I it seems as though those things are arbitrary depending on the teacher. And the best argument I can make for really building in consistency around some of those core components and using shared success criteria for the standards and so on. If as a group of teachers, if you were to say to a group of teachers, hey, this year you'll have 8 different principals, and they've all got their frameworks for quality instruction, and they'll all be evaluating you in their own way, and they're professionals, and I trust their judgment, and they'll do their thing. And then next semester you'll have 8 new principals, and next year you'll have 8. The teachers would say, wait a second, this doesn't seem fair. Shouldn't the organization have consensus around what quality teaching looks like? Shouldn't we be assessed in valid, reliable, consistent ways? And they'd have every right to make that argument. I think students deserve the same. And there's just a mountain of research around clear instructional goals, guaranteeing viable curriculum, valid, reliable assessment, shared understanding of the standards, is a really powerful way to get on the same page and help all students move forward.
Well, and let's be honest, we could have had an entire episode just on lever 3.
Yes.
But we will move to lever 4, strategy, which is summed up by you point out that it encompasses all of the other components related to how educators use their knowledge of, say, effective curriculum, instruction, assessment to engage in those practices that maximize student learning. And so we try to move this lever by pulling on one of the 3 previously mentioned levers. And
Right.
so we already know now this doesn't work. So tell us how to use the strategy lever effectively.
Yep. So when we talk about strategy, we're really focused on in the classroom. What are the tools any teacher has in his or her tool belt to take any student from where they are now to the next level. We talk about strategy in terms of expertise, and a book I alluded to earlier that David Livingston, Bob Marzano, and I did on effective instruction. We talk about systems that support expertise in there, and the book I did more recently with Paul Milkey, a CD book, Making Teachers Better, Not Bitter. We talk about teacher expertise. But here's the essence. Anders Ericsson's research on expertise is really critically important. We know what experts do, right? We know how experts improve their craft.
Uh-huh.
And the essence of expertise is experts use the right strategy in the right way at the right time to get the results that they desire. So, given a learning goal, given any group of students in front of me, um, we always have to be attuned to, what is it these students need to take those next steps in their learning, and how can I best align strategy to learning goal. So, for example, Bob Marzano's work on the art and science of teaching. When classroom instruction that works came out, everyone was doing lots and lots of workshops on the nine, instructional strategies in that framework. And what Bob subsequently kind of stepped back as he saw how his work was being implemented and said that there's no such thing as a high yield strategy, right? There's no such thing as a strategy that works every time. So, for example, you can take a strategy like compare and contrast, which has a really high effect size for improving student learning. But if I'm using compare and contrast uh, at the beginning of a unit, when I'm introducing a new concept or a new set of content to students that they don't understand yet, then compare and contrast is a really lousy strategy. If I'm asking them to compare, and contrast two things that they don't know about.
Sure.
Further into the unit, once kids have some conceptual understanding and some content under their belt, compare and contrast can be a great strategy. Or to give a metaphor of something that all kids at that particular age group, whatever it may be, are familiar with, and ask them to compare how this thing that they've started to internalize some content around, that can be a great strategy. But to say there's a handful of strategies that work every time just isn't the case. So here's what happens with people in their pursuit of getting better is this. Our initial exposure in any discipline or any field, whether it's teaching or medicine, or there are some tasks that if we don't learn really quickly, there's some skills and strategies. If we don't learn really quickly, we just won't even survive in the discipline. But those types of skills become autonomous without a whole lot of practice. So we engage in this steep learning curve, and then they become autonomous. But driving a car is a great example. Right, as you learn to drive a car, that's all new and it's not very fluid. But once you get the hang of it, now you're driving to work and eating a breakfast sandwich and drinking coffee, and right,
And
so that
not even thinking about driving.
Yeah, exactly. So that skill becomes autonomous. But here's what experts do is, as they become autonomous in one skill, they look to the next skill to develop. So they're always trying to stay in what we call that novice learning curve. So people who are in pursuit of expertise, they're always adding new strategies. They're always looking at that nuance of, oh, what's the learning goal? Okay, where are students in a cycle of learning that? Is that learning goal conceptual? Is it content? Is it skill? How much exposure have they had? Okay, what's the ultimate goal? Where only if they had all that information would they be able to say, it looks like this would be the instructional strategy that is best aligned, best suited. Experts, see that complexity and very quickly cut through and find clarity to determine what's the strategy, the right way, the right time to get the results that they desire. A challenge in the field that is in some ways unique to teaching. I mean, teaching is incredibly complex. Anyone who says it isn't just doesn't understand.
They've never been in it.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And a key component of expertise is watching others engage in their craft. So, imagine trying to get better at golf if after you emerged from, you got your bachelor's degree in golf, and now you're going to spend the rest of your career never watching other people swing the clubs. It's really hard to keep improving in isolation. But that's oftentimes kind of the trajectory in schooling. It takes or in teaching. It takes a few years on the job to really get a sense of, okay, I think I've got the gist of this now. Unfortunately, what happens oftentimes is, you know, people reach that level of kind of automaticity. They're autonomous in their classrooms, and they're very competent in their classrooms, but they just don't have enough exposure to watching other teachers teach, um, in order to really take those next steps where they keep adding tools to their tool belt to help teachers improve. Which is one reason why I'm a huge advocate of video, of teachers videoing themselves, teachers watching other teachers teach, and not because teachers should be evaluating other teachers, but they should be using what other teachers do uh, for their own reflection, and how are they continuously honing uh, their their craft.
Oh, absolutely. Which I don't know. It seems like a good segue into that fifth lever, which is self. And so, just as it seems, we're talking about the set of beliefs that teachers and students, and I think it's important to catch that it's and students have about their capacity to be effective. But am I know this is the fifth lever. It was towards the end of the book, but am I interpreting this correctly that it's this lever is the foundation for the other four levers?
Yep. Yeah. And yeah. So the way the book is set up is kind of, what do we typically pull? What do we typically talk about? Then it builds toward, almost, kind of a save the best for last. Um, and the metaphor that we use to talk about the importance of self and kind of the place of other levers is to lead like a penguin. And the idea there is simply that, if you're a penguin on an iceberg, uh, all you see is right what's above the surface of the water.
Right.
Well, if you're going to survive, you have to dive down deep to get that krill that's well below the surface. And when you dive down, you realize that what is visible, sits on a much larger but not visible foundation. And a lot of the planning work we do, or when we try to tackle problems, it's almost like we treat the surface as the iceberg, as all that exists or all that matters. And we start with the structure of the school in our planning work. It's really that foundational component are the kids, right? What do we want our kids to be like? What do kids believe to be true? I like the saying, show me a kid who thinks he can, a kid who thinks she can't, and they're both going to be right
Absolutely.
every time. And I love the banner in front of a school that says all students can learn. And it's critically important, that staff believes that statement to be true. But do the kids believe that to be true? Do kids, to if a kid is successful, to what do they attribute that success? Do they just attribute, well, I'm good at that particular discipline? And then if they don't do well, they say, well, I must not be good in that particular discipline. Strategy is always the variable that we want to direct kids toward. It's Jeff Howard's work on efficacy out of the Efficacy Institute. It's Carol Dweck's work on mindset. And I think sometimes people give kind of short shrift, or there's some critiques of Dweck's work that are out there, for example. And if we're just kind of teaching that or preaching that as a philosophy, work hard, get smart, or then there's not a lot to it. But if we are really living and breathing and modeling and helping kids understand that struggle is a part of any system where people get better, if we don't really model that asking questions is as valuable as knowing the right answer. If in our language we always emphasize performance goals rather than learning goals, we can, unintentionally send kids a message that all you have to do is try harder, and things will work. That's not always the case. If I'm not using the right strategy, it might not matter how hard I try. It's futile. So we have to align then really the goal of any system where we're trying to help other people improve. It's how do we help the learner, whether it's math or swimming or writing or whatever it may be. How do we help that learner understand, here's what quality work looks like, right? This is the goal you're trying to attain. Here's where you are now, and that's okay. And here's what that next level of learning looks like, and here's the strategy that you're going to use to get to that next level. If all three, of those components aren't clear to the learner, then they'll always be dependent on the teacher, or they might just give up. So how do we help better align people's conceptions of themselves as learners to clarity of goals, what they're striving toward, and clarity of strategy, and how that strategy can be deployed? If we don't have those three components in place, we're always going to fall short in how we support others' learning. And those three things, can happen independent of structural changes or sampling how we group and cluster kids in schools. And that's kind of the core of pulling these components together. If we find ourselves pulling the structural lever or the sample lever, but it's purely transactional, and we were expecting other things to change kind of magically, we've got to hit the pause button and say, why did we start this initiative? If we're trying to engage in change around standard, strategy, and self, but the only people who notice it are the teachers on the curriculum committee, or if the only time we use that new strategy we learned is because we really like it and we end up using it all the time, kind of regardless of what the learning goal is, we're always going to fall short. So standard, strategy, and self, it's about that interrelationship between teacher and empowering the child to navigate their own learning. And that's where I think John Hattie, in his synthesis and meta-analysis, says it best, and I think they're really two statements that should guide anytime we're engaged in change or efforts at improvement in schools. And it's the notion that students learn at a rate higher than we would have anticipated when each teacher sees his or her classroom through the eyes of his or her students, and each student sees him or herself as his or her own best teacher. Ultimately, it's about standing in the shoes of the kids that we serve and empowering them to move on to next levels of learning. And as people start to think about the five levers and change and the magnitudes of change, you can pretty quickly start to untangle why some initiatives, a lot of time, effort, resource spent, but they didn't move the needle on student learning. And the five levers to improve learning framework, it kind of gives a language that I don't think we have in the field to really cut to the chase related to what we're doing and why, and how it's going to be a benefit to kids and teachers.
Well, and I definitely think that we summarize the five levers, but whenever you actually dive into the book and you see a wealth of examples and everything, it becomes a lot more clear. I know it did for me,
Yeah,
and
sure.
and that's why I'm going to have a link to this book on my website,
Great.
so people can get to it, because it was an impactful book on me, and I hope that others read it and they feel the same way, because we can really, I think, change is always going to be scary. I don't think we ever said anywhere today that we're going to lessen that, but we
No,
can make it a whole lot easier if we begin affecting change with the right lever. So,
exactly.
Tony, thank you so much for joining us on Anchored in Education today.
Great. Thank you, Scott.
Now, you can follow Tony on Twitter today. Search at Tony Frontier to find him. And don't forget to head over to escottengland.com and click on the Read More link from today's episode to read more about Tony and find resources, including links to his books. Now, not many books cause me to truly stop and think. And also, not many books deliver a gut check such as this. While reading this book, I realized how many times I have pulled the wrong lever when trying to affect change. Tony and I actually extended our conversation beyond today's episode. I will be sharing out bonus pieces throughout the week on Twitter and my website. I see too often change be implemented without a solid grasp on what should be changed. I even said it while talking to Tony. I'm guilty of this myself. It was like I said last week when talking about the Titanic. We cannot simply rearrange pieces when restructuring is what is needed. To bring about the wrong change can cause your students, staff, and community members to lose trust in you. You'll become known as the person who brings about change on a whim without any true fidelity. And this is applicable to classroom teaching as well, a fact we will find out in a few weeks when we talk classroom management. Now, change is necessary. In a utopian world, everything is perfect and change is not needed. That is most definitely not education. Let's work together to implement the right change by pulling the right lever, because at the end of the day, we are all anchored in education.